Hey, what's going on, guys? Brian from Zombie Guitar here. In this lesson, we are going to look at soloing with arpeggios, okay? So what I was doing there in that demo was I was soloing using arpeggios over top of the chord sequence that was in the rhythm section, okay? So this is kind of like an alternative way of looking at things if you're used to looking at things in terms of scales, okay? So instead of thinking, okay, we're in this key, so we're going to play this scale over this progression, which is where a lot of intermediate guitar players get stuck at. We're now looking at each individual chord, and we are using different pathways, okay, called arpeggio pathways, to solo over each chord as it occurs in the chord sequence. Alright, so the way I'm going to explain this is essentially a three-step process, and it's really not that difficult to do, so check it out. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do is you first want to determine the scalar framework of the chord progression. Okay, so you look at the chords in the chord progression and you determine what scalar framework you're going to use. Okay, so basically the way that you can do that is you can look at all the chords and you can remove all the extensions and just look at the major or minor quality of each chord. So the chords that I was soloing over in the demo there was a B minor 7 chord, to an A7 chord, to a D major chord, to a E9 chord, or E minor 9 chord. Okay, so you can ignore all those extensions and then just reduce this to simply a B minor chord, to an A major chord, to a D major chord, to an E minor chord. So you take those chords and you look at what type of scalar framework you should use based on that chord sequence. And this is actually a pretty easy one because all of these chords fall right into the key of B minor. Okay. It could also be, you could also say that this is in D major because those are relative to one another. But because the first chord is a B minor, we're just going to say that B minor is our scalar framework. You can verify this by looking at the circle of fifths and looking at the grouping of 6 diatonic chords for the key of either B minor or D major, and see that these 6 chords right here, if any of those 6 chords are used and no other chords aside from those chords are used, then you're right in the key of either B minor or D major. Okay? If other out-of-key chords were used, that may be a different scalar framework, but this puts us right in the key of B minor. Alright? So, let's zoom into the guitar here, and or zoom into the fretboard here, and take a look at what the B minor scalar framework looks like spanned across the entire guitar. Okay, so what you see here is the scalar framework for the key of B minor. All right, so every single dot that you see on this fretboard is part of the key of B minor. The reason that that is our scalar framework is because the 4 chords within the chord progression that we're soloing over are all part of the key of B minor. There's nothing out of key here, so all 4 chords are completely diatonic to the key of B minor. Alright, now the white dots indicate the root, the scale root, which is B. Okay, so all the white dots are the note B, and all of the black dots are the rest of the scale of the key of B minor. Okay, so a lot of guitar players will stop here. They will simply say, okay, I'm in the key of B minor, this chord progression is in the key of B minor, so I'll just play my B minor scale patterns up and down the neck, and it's going to sound pretty good. However, a lot of people get stuck there. Okay, that's kind of like an intermediate sticking point that a lot of guitar players get stuck at. Okay, so this is just step 1 of how you would go about soloing with arpeggios. So let's look at step 2. Okay, so step 2 would be to look at the triad of each individual chord. Okay, so as I said in the beginning, the chords that we're soloing over are B minor 7, to an A7, to a D major, to an E minor 9. Alright, but you can just look at each one of those triads, okay? You can ignore the extensions and just look at the triads, okay? So instead of looking at a B minor 7, we would just look at a B minor chord. And instead of looking at an A7 chord or an A dominant 7 chord, we would just look at an A major chord. Then we would look at a D major chord, and then instead of looking at an E minor 9, we would ignore the extension and just look at the E minor triad. Okay, so essentially what you want to do is you want to map out each of the triads for each of the chords spanning the entire neck of the guitar. And the way that you would do that is you would do so using the caged system, okay? I have lots of lessons on the caged system, lots of lessons on arpeggios, how to lay out arpeggios on the fretboard, how to look at arpeggios in a position by position basis. All of these things will be linked below in the description, so you can check out those other lessons. But for the purpose of this lesson, just understand that within this scalar framework, you're going to just want to map out the triad for each individual chord. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So our overall scalar framework is the key of B minor. The key of B minor is what you see here. So let's look at the arpeggio, the triad layout for the B minor chord. Okay, so as you see here, the green dots all indicate chord tones, okay? They are all part of the B minor chord, okay? So the B minor chord contains the notes B, D, and F sharp. So any green dot that you see is going to be either a B, a D, or an F sharp, okay, within the key of B minor. All right, so you can go ahead and you can kind of just walk up and down any one of these arpeggios and use that as your pathway. Okay, so maybe let's start here on the 14th fret. Let's try this arpeggio. 14th fret, pinky on the A string. Or maybe you might want to do this arpeggio down here on the 7th fret on the low E string, first finger. Maybe walk through this arpeggio. Or maybe you want to take your first finger and put it here on the 14th fret of the A string and walk through this B minor arpeggio. Okay, these are all just different pathways that you can take, and they're all arpeggios of the B minor chord, meaning that they contain the exact same notes that the B minor chord contains. Here's a B minor chord. It contains the notes B, D, and F sharp. So do all of the green dots that you see here. These are all B's, D's, and F sharps, okay? So when you're walking through these arpeggios, this is now essentially your new pathway. So instead of thinking in terms of scales and doing things like this, instead of doing things like that, using your scale as the pathway, you now use these arpeggios as your new pathway. So you can do things like, okay, something like that, or maybe something like this, or maybe something like this. Okay, so there's these green dots are now your arpeggio pathways that you would use to essentially, instead of the scalar pathway, you're now taking the chord pathway, okay? So that's for just the B minor chord. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at it for the A major chord. Okay, so now you see the scalar framework underneath still remains the same, but now the green dots are indicating the notes of the A major chord. Okay, the A major chord contains the notes A, C sharp, and E. Therefore, all of these green dots are A's, C sharps, and E's. Okay, so you have your A major chord. Okay, and you have all these different arpeggio pathways for that particular A major chord. Okay. All these different arpeggio pathways. And then you would go ahead and you would determine what the triad layout for the D major chord is. Okay, so you have your D major chord. And you have a bunch of different arpeggios. So the D major chord contains the notes D, F sharp, and A. Therefore, all these green dots are Ds, F sharps, and As within the context of the B minor key, okay? The scalar framework is the key of B minor. The arpeggio layout over top of it for this particular chord, which is D major, is D, F sharp, and A, okay? So you have your arpeggios within the key of, or you have your arpeggios for the D major chord. All of those are part of the arpeggio, okay? So all of the green dots are part of the D major chord. And then the last one is the E minor triad, okay? So your E minor chord, all right, so, same thing. All the green dots are part of the E minor chord, okay? So the E minor chord contains the notes E, G, and B. Therefore, all of the green dots are the notes E, G, and B, okay? All right, so all of these green dots are E's, G's, and B's, all right? So that is step 2. You want to essentially just look at the triad layout for each of the chords and just have that basically mapped out in your head before we move on to step 3. Okay, so the third step is you want to connect the arpeggio pathways or the triad pathways that you laid out for each chord. You want to connect that to the underlying scalar framework. All right, so the thing to keep in mind is that the arpeggio, the triad layouts, they are always going to remain constant regardless of what the scalar framework is, okay? So a B minor chord, the B minor arpeggios spanned across the fretboard are always going to remain the same, whether that B minor chord is found in the key of B minor, or whether that B minor chord is found in the key of G major, or whether that B minor chord is found in the B Dorian mode, or whether that, no matter what the scalar framework is, which changes depending upon what the chord progression is, the triad layout will always remain the same because the notes on the fretboard are always going to remain the same. So a B minor chord contains the notes B, D, and F sharp. So all up and down the fretboard, B, D, and F sharp is always going to remain in the exact same spots, okay? So I hope that makes sense. So essentially what you want to do is you want to connect the triad arpeggio pathways, which we laid out in step 2, to the underlying scalar framework, okay? Now you want to have the arpeggios as your primary pathways, but you can veer off your path a little bit by hitting nearby scale tones from the scalar framework. Some ways you might want to go about approaching this is I can't recommend the caged system enough, okay? That's what I would do. I would memorize the caged system, and I would learn it in each of the different positions, okay? I have multiple lessons on this stuff, all on my chord tone soloing series, okay? I break it down position by position basis. I relate the caged shapes to the 5 pentatonic positions, all kinds of stuff. Another thing you might want to do is check out my lead guitar improv course, okay? The way that I do the improv course is you have the fretboard diagrams on the screen, and as the chords are changing, just as you saw in the demo, the arpeggio layouts lights up on the fretboard diagrams, okay? So I give you all different types of chord progressions, all different types of scalar frameworks to work in, and for each one of the scalar frameworks, you get the opportunity to do arpeggio exercises, okay? So it never hurts to practice with a backing track, and it definitely never hurts to have the fretboard diagrams on the screen as the chords are changing, showing you exactly how to move through these arpeggios. So that may be something that you're interested in. If so, check it out. If you have any questions about it, feel free to ask. I think you may find it pretty helpful. But that's going to be it for this lesson for today. I may do more lessons on the same subject. We may get a little deeper into this whole concept. Excuse me. But that's going to do it for today's lesson. So any questions, comments, anything you want to say, let me know. Other than that, thanks for watching.